All right, let's get started. Thanks for joining us. My name's Julia McLeod, and I am the Outreach Director for the Harpswell Heritage Land Trust. And all this year in 2021, we've been offering webinars on the topic of stories of change from people from all walks of life, talking about a lot of different topics. We've had some really interesting ones. I encourage you to watch some recordings of past webinars on our website. And I'll tell you that the next one coming up is going to be on October 26th, and it's all about rockweed. So if you're interested in rockweed, you should join us then. We will have webinars in November and December too, but those aren't quite set up. So I hope you'll join us for one of those upcoming topics. So today I'm super excited to have Ania Wright talk with us about the global climate justice movement and connecting that to Maine. I'm really excited to hear from her, and I'm sure you all will too. So I will stop sharing my screen and pass it off. Oh, I will mention one more thing as we get started, that I welcome you to type questions into the chat at any time during the webinar. So I'm not going to ask Ania to look at the chat while she's talking, but at the end, we'll have some time that I'll come back on and ask those questions. So while you're thinking of it, feel free to type it into the chat and we'll get to them when we get to the end. All right, thanks so much for being here, Ania.
Thanks so much, Julia. And thank you to you and the Harpswell Heritage Land Trust for having me this evening. I'm really excited to be able to talk to you all this evening about my journey as a climate activist, both what I used to feel climate activism was and what I see it as today, and about my journey of climate activism from a global level to a local level. And I see that solving the climate crisis and the systemic issues that have caused it will take more than just, evaluating and changing our own lives, but it'll take the courage to change our systems and to see the interconnectedness in the threats that face our communities today and the mobilization of everyone. So I'd like to start a little bit about kind of my vision for the future. When I think about what our world looks like in the year 2030, which is just about 8 years in the future, give or take, I think of a world where we have reached zero emissions, so not net zero, but zero, where we have held corporations accountable for their destruction of our planet, where we are recognizing our country's historical injustices openly and are well on the way to being an anti-racist and anti-colonialist society, and where everyone has a voice and is able to seek justice, where we can look forward to a future where our children can live safely. And so thinking about that future, especially today, 2030 is really about changing everything. So my activism journey really started when I was in high school with my school's recycling team. I graduated from Falmouth High School in 2015. And throughout high school, I saw the climate crisis as an issue with just a few solutions, using less, recycling more, moving to renewable energy, and any other issues that I felt were important in high school, like anti-racism or income equality or healthcare for all. They felt totally unrelated, but still important. And it wasn't until college that I learned the term climate justice. And so to throw a quick definition at you all, climate justice requires the recognition that the climate crisis was caused by failures of our political, social, and economic systems. So it demands intersectional solutions that cross disciplines and that will transform our systems and hold those responsible for the climate crisis accountable, resulting in a livable future where all can thrive. And to quote Greta Thunberg here, she once said, once you've done your homework, you realize that we need new politics. We need a new economy where everything is based on our rapidly declining and extremely limited carbon budget. But that is not enough. We need a whole new way of thinking. We must stop competing with each other. We need to start cooperating and sharing the remaining resources of this planet in a fair way. So I'm going to take a little bit of time now to talk about these, systems that I'm talking about and how they relate both globally and locally to the climate crisis. So I'm going to break it down. I'm going to talk a little bit about our political system, our economic system, and then our social systems and sort of the history of the United States. So to talk about politics and power first, as we all know, those in power politically don't always have everyone's best interests at heart, but instead maintaining power and the status quo. And when I talk about those in political power, I'm not just talking about politicians, but also corporations and folks that wield a lot of power in the systems that we currently have. So to illustrate this a bit, in college, I went to College of the Atlantic and graduated this past year or last June. I had the privilege of traveling to the UN Climate Conference in Madrid, Spain, where I really saw these dynamics firsthand. So when you look at emissions over time, the United States is the country most responsible for the climate crisis. And we're also one of the powerful countries in the world, and that's not a coincidence. At these negotiations, the UN Climate Conference negotiations, the US is a real powerhouse. And because of our world power and need to maintain it, we're really not paying our fair share, and many are getting left behind. There are really deep inequalities between those who are most responsible for the climate crisis and those who are victim to it. I'm going to start with a little story that I think reflects how broken the system is and how important it is that we rethink our relationship with political power when it comes to climate change. A young man that I met in Madrid named Carlan Zakaras, who's from the Marshall Islands. He spoke about 16-foot swells his country experienced earlier that year during a storm that forced 200 people from their island, which is just 2 meters above sea level. And they've really been asked as a country to adapt and elevate with migration from their island, the only plan B, even though they're responsible for 0.000, that's 4 zeros, 1% of emissions globally. And so this is really imbalanced when you look at the effects that the country is having or that experiencing due to the climate crisis and how much they actually contributed to the current crisis. And so where is the US in this? There are many reasons to speculate. It's hard to convince a country that has a hard time atoning for its injustice on its own soil to care about people outside its borders. But furthermore, we're generally comfortable in the US, and climate change is not the same threat here yet as it is in the Maldives, and change takes discomfort. And so to put this story into some math terms, which may be annoying to some, but helpful to others, globally, when we look at emissions over time, we see that people with the most money are also the people with the highest emissions. So the world's richest 10% cause 50% of emissions, and also claim about 52% of the world's wealth. The world's poorest 50%, who have about 8% of the world's total wealth, contribute just 10% of global emissions. And when we look at climate change impacts, you need money to adapt. And so all this means is that those most responsible for climate change are relatively insulated from its impacts, because they can pay to be insulated from its impacts, and those least responsible for climate change are unable to adapt. And then when we look at it from a countrywide perspective, we see that between 1850 and 2002, countries in the global north, and global north meaning developed countries like the US, countries in the European Union, etc., those countries emitted 3 times as many greenhouse gas emissions as countries in the global south, meaning much of the continent of Africa, South America, and parts of Asia. And this part of the world is where approximately 85% of the global population resides. So the average CO2 emissions per capita of citizens in countries most vulnerable to climate change impacts, for example, Mozambique, where the average person emits 0.3 metric tons a year. These pale in comparison to the average emissions of a person in the US who emits about 15.5 tons a year. It's further estimated by the Climate Vulnerable Forum that the 85 lowest emitting countries in the world who have contributed virtually nothing to the problem will bear 40% of the economic losses and 80% of the resulting deaths of climate change. Which those are big, very significant numbers. So if the US were to actually achieve its fair share of emissions reductions, we would have to reduce our emissions by 195% by 2030, meaning getting to at least 70% emissions reductions nationally, and then the remainder through support to developing countries to reduce their emissions. And so I know like folks are really excited about Biden's climate plan, which is a good step forward, but it's not anywhere close to this 195% that would be the US's fair share. And so to transition this to the state of Maine, when we think about these political and power issues, the same patterns emerge because it's still within the same system. So the climate action plan in Maine, though it was very ambitious, didn't include any talk of what a fair share of Maine might look like on a global scale or at a state scale. The same statistics kind of play out at the state level. The wealthiest Mainers and largest corporations have emitted the most over time, and the most poverty-stricken Mainers have the greatest barriers to adapting. So to illustrate this, like think about a hot day in July in 2025, and who has access to air conditioning, who can afford the extra cost on your electric bill, who can afford to go to the hospital if they experience heat stroke. And the environmental movement in Maine and the Maine government have not given adequate power to those most vulnerable to climate change, but we are working towards it. It may start with having the equity subcommittee for the Maine Climate Council, or by providing stipends to folks who need it for their time to participate in a project. But what would it look like for power to truly be shifted in Maine or in our international climate space? And in Maine in particular, from our primarily white, older, wealthy legislature and well-paid, primarily white environmental organizations that primarily serve Southern Maine. What would that look like if we shifted to a system that truly represents and uplifts those who don't historically hold power or don't have access to power? So going back to this 2030 theme, in 2030, I hope that political power in Maine looks like a state where young folks have a say in what the state does, where you don't have to be retired to run for office or to have the time to volunteer for an organization. It looks like to me a movement where rural Mainers feel just as represented by the environmental movement in Maine as Southern Mainers, where tribal sovereignty is respected and uplifted. And as I asked the folks, in this Zoom room and in this virtual space who are representing those primarily represented groups currently, the older folks, the wealthy folks, the white folks, and I include myself within this, within these buckets. What can you do to shift power? What work do you need to do to ensure your voice is not valued above others, even if you think your opinion is important? And again, I say this as someone who is white, who had access to a college college education and now a job, but also as someone who thinks about what changes I need to make every day. So I'm going to shift to talk about our economy, and as Julia mentioned at the beginning, if anyone has questions throughout, my talk, please feel free to put them in the chat. But I'm going to shift now to talk a little bit about our economy and the problems that come along with it in terms of climate change. So the way our economy works, the way that capitalism tells us to put growth and profit above all else, has led to our society valuing our world and our people less and money and profit more. So instead of valuing our future generations, corporations and the government value profits now at the expense of our planet and people in the future. And globally, I see this in continued investment in fossil fuel infrastructure and monoculture farming, practices that we know will not benefit people in the long run, but in the short run have a lot of profit. And you may be surprised, or honestly not at all surprised, to learn that the fossil fuel industry receives more funding than the Pentagon annually through direct and indirect subsidies. So hopefully we're hoping to change that with the budget reconciliation bill in the federal government right now. But when you think about that, that's, subsidizing the fossil fuel industry is really not long-term thinking. And so in Maine, this past year, I was thinking about this a lot with the natural gas industry. Summit Natural Gas, which is a national corporation that has business in Maine, proposed a gas line through mid-coast Maine, from Belfast to Lincolnville. And natural or fracked gas has been advertised as a bridge fuel, as something that is less expensive and has less emissions than oil. And the project in the Mid-Coast was supported by large local businesses and by the town councils of Belfast, because they were offered and saw large dollar signs. This was a project that they were told would stimulate the local economy and lower gas prices. Summit was offering a refund of up to $3,000 for those who joined the project. But when we look at the reality of it, fracked gas isn't even the cheapest heating option. It costs on average over $2,500 per year to heat a home using fracked natural gas, while a heat pump powered by solar only costs a little over $1,000 a year. And furthermore, jobs in the fossil fuel industry are declining, and any job creation as a result of this project would have been temporary and only would have created a few long-term jobs. Meanwhile, renewable energy jobs offer more long-term security and are the fastest growing occupation in the US. And so as the fracked gas industry continues to decline, consumers would have been left with a useless stranded asset and would have eventually had to upgrade their systems again to run on electricity. But still, even with all of these downsides, the project was given a real thought. And thank goodness, due to grassroots organizing and an outpouring of community action, the project was canceled. But we were left with these questions of why did fracked gas even have the chance to begin with? And why are these fracked gas representatives given voice on the Maine Climate Council working groups, or still given subsidies at the national level? And why are we letting the profit of companies be a factor in the future of our state? And why aren't we automatically putting people first? And so all this to say, in order to solve the climate crisis, we need to stop giving fossil fuel companies the benefit of the doubt. They've proved quite obviously that they have no intention of being held accountable or stopping their expansion. And we need to invest instead in our communities and create an economic system where people are always put first. So finally, I'd like to speak a little bit about social issues in this country and in Maine and how they relate to climate change and climate justice. So the way that the US came to be through colonial practices of displacing Native people and forcing our own Western practices onto other countries. These practices have left real scars on our planet. It's led Americans to believe that they have dominion over land and people, and allowed for the continued destruction of our environment and the oppression of Indigenous peoples. The fact that I keep at the forefront of my mind is that despite being only 5% of the global population, Indigenous communities hold about 80% of the world's biodiversity. And so we, the colonizers, have a broken relationship with our world. To throw in another quote here, Sherry Mitchell, who's a well-known Penobscot and Passamaquoddy author, an activist, in her essay titled Indigenous Prophecy and Mother Earth, says that unfortunately a great deal of critical Indigenous knowledge has remained outside the carefully ordered categorization of Western thought, making its holistic concepts difficult to comprehend for those who have been trained to see the world in fractured pieces. It is this fractured view that has been central to the framing of our societies and environment. Ironically, she says, the Indigenous ways of knowing and being that European colonists saw as primitive are now actively being sought out to save our environment and mankind from brink of extinction. And so here in this region that we call Maine, the Wabanaki tribes, the Penobscot Nation, Passamaquoddy tribe, Holton Band of Maliseet, and Aroostook Band of Micmacs, as well as the Abenaki and other tribal communities living in diaspora outside of Maine. They've lived in what is now Maine for over 16,000 years. And throughout these thousands of years, the tribes have lived in relationship with the land and waters here, managing natural resources so that future generations can thrive. In just a few hundred years since European settlers colonized Maine, the Wabanaki have lost 98% of their population, access to both land and waters, their ability to sustain themselves in traditional ways, and so much more. In the 1970s, Wabanaki tribes still had legal claim to more than 1 million acres of land that were then owned by private landowners in the state of Maine. Returning that land to the tribes would likely have led to extreme hostilities and never-ending legal proceedings, so the US brokered a deal with the state of Maine on behalf of the tribes, the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act of 1980. And this act was intended to provide funds and outline a process for the tribes to purchase land to replace the land that they had unlawfully lost. And in this exchange, the tribes gave up their legal claim to those dispossessed lands. And due to many factors, the tribes have not been able to purchase nearly the amount of the land that was intended by the act. And at a time when climate change and environmental degradation are accelerating at terrifying rates due to Western ways of living and untethered climate change, restoring the Wabanaki tribe's ability to manage tribal lands, waters, and resources will help protect all children and future generations. And it's just the right thing to do. And so recognizing the Wabanaki tribe's inherent sovereignty is a first step to recognizing and beginning to heal the deep suffering that European settlers in the state of Maine have inflicted. Excuse me. So racism has also made communities more susceptible to the climate crisis in Maine and around the US. This includes the disproportionate impacts of poverty, housing instability, and poor healthcare access for Black, Indigenous, and people of color that make them more susceptible to climate-induced disasters, and the environmental racism that leads BIPOC communities to face negative health impacts from racist land use, zoning, and redlining. For example, Black Americans are 75% more likely than white Americans to live in fence line communities next to commercial facilities. And Maine is a very white state, but that in no way means that we don't have racism or climate and racism impacts. This 2 summers ago, or last summer, 27.7% of COVID-19 cases, despite the fact that Black residents represent just 1.4 of the state's population. 27.7% of COVID cases were Black Mainers, despite them just being 1.4% of the state's population. Meaning, if you're Black in Maine, you're 25% or 25 times more likely to get COVID-19. And Maine, had among the lowest COVID-19 infection rates in the country on a per capita basis. But the picture is dramatically different for Black residents, a growing number of whom are recent immigrants with lower incomes, who have more limited access to healthcare and less job security even before the pandemic. My dear friend and activist ally, Josh Wood, who is a youth climate and racial justice activist in Sanford, Maine, said something once that has really stuck with me. He said that as a biracial person in Maine, activism is not a choice, it's survival. To quote another climate justice activist, Mary Anise Hagler, who's a Black climate justice activist, wrote an essay and said, wrote an essay called "Home is Always Worth It." And in that essay, she said, "I've come across a good many doomer dudes. They have books, they have panels, and they're almost always white men because only white men can afford to be lazy enough to quit." Which is, something that really stuck with me in terms of, especially as a young person within the climate movement, that there are many people on the planet these days who don't have a choice when it comes to activism, and there are many that do. And so all these issues that I've just mentioned, which are very big, societal things, capitalism, colonialism, racism, extractivism, they're all systemic issues that we're all a part of, whether we want to be or not. I think not this past summer, but the summer before, many folks were confronting these issues with racism in particular, with the killings of George Floyd and other unarmed Black folks. And I know, I've been learning a lot about my own racism and about my own understanding of the world and how I, as a white woman, contribute to racism without even knowing it. And without dismantling these systems of oppression, racism and colonialism and capitalism, we can't solve the climate crisis, and we won't even get close. And the work needs to be done at a community level, at a personal level, at a state level, and at the global level. And so I'm going to shift now into the kind of what can you do portion of my talk. And I think the first step for myself, and I hope for all of you, is really on just educating yourself. In Maine, many schools are not equipped to teach about climate science yet. Hopefully we'll have legislation and resources to change that soon. But I know as someone who graduated high school in 2015, I wasn't really taught about climate change other than maybe one lesson in my biology class. But all that to say, we're really not up to speed about what is going on. And so educating yourself is huge. And two resources that I really recommend are the book All We Can Save, which is an anthology of essays by climate activists all over the world. And I think it just gives a really good perspective and understanding of what I was talking about tonight, and what some real climate solutions are I also recommend that folks read the Maine Climate Council scientific report to learn more about climate change in Maine and how it will affect you and your community. Assuming everyone that's listening is from Maine, but apologies if there are folks from out of state. Some other things you can do are start something within your community. I think a very valuable lesson that I learned in attending these global climate change conferences is that, you know, international action is really slow and can be really difficult, and certainly is worth pursuing and understanding and fighting for. But really where I've felt like I've had the most impact is within my community, within my state, within my town, because those are the communities that I understand the best. And those are the problems that I feel like I understand the best. And so there are plenty of ways to get involved within your community, whether it be, you know, working with the Harpswell Heritage Land Trust, or I work with Sierra Club Maine, and we have community climate action teams all over the state, which are groups of folks working within their communities on passing town climate plans or building municipal solar, doing all those things that may feel small, but really have a snowball effect when it comes to real climate solutions within the state. And if you're a young person, there are great organizations. There's the Maine Environmental Changemakers Network. There's Maine Youth for Climate Justice, both of which are organizations working to empower young folks within the state. And those are, yeah, really great ways to tap in and get involved. And then lastly is to really give space for both hope and grief within the climate crisis. I think there's so many heavy things happening in our world right now. And there's so much to juggle and so much to think through and to process. And so it's okay to not be okay about the climate crisis. It's a really heavy topic and it's really terrifying. But there's also a lot to be hopeful for within it. Going back to my initial visioning at the beginning of my talk, we really have the opportunity to solve so much more than just environmental disasters when it comes to climate change. And that gives me so much hope day to day. But feeling both of those, both the hope and the grief, is so important as we move forward. Because both, if given in too high doses, can lead to inaction. And so figuring out how to balance those for yourself is very important. And I think I'll wrap up there. And yeah, and if folks have questions, please do type them in the chat. I'm happy to talk more about any of the points that I touched on this evening. And I'll also toss my email in the chat in case anyone's interested in starting a community action team with Sierra Club. But yeah, again, just thank you all so much for having me this evening. And I'm seeing one question in the chat, but Julie, I'm not sure if you had a certain way that you wanted to do questions.
Feel free, go ahead with that one, and then I'll read out the rest of them, but you can start with that one.
Cool, sounds good. Yeah, thanks, Brock. So yeah, I guess I probably should have started with that at the beginning too, but I'll talk about it now. So I started my climate change work in college really seriously, and then helped to develop Maine Youth for Climate Justice, which I just spoke about, which is a youth network of over 300 youth in Maine, working on climate justice issues around the state. And Maine Environmental Changemakers Network is also a part of that. And Brock, I know you're familiar with that network. yeah, from there, I graduated from College of the Atlantic last June, and then shortly after started working with the Sierra Club Maine chapter and their Grassroots Climate Action Organizer. And yeah, I help with organizing local climate action campaigns and efforts, and also help out with some of the diversity, equity, and inclusion work that the chapter is doing. And then I'm also the youth representative on the Maine Climate Council, and helped to work on the Maine Won't Wait climate action plan that came out last December.
Great, thanks. So again, just feel free to type into the chat. I'll ask a question of mine. So this is coming from the perspective of an educator. So I do quite a bit of work with kids as part of my job with the Land Trust. And so I'm curious about your real dedication to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if you think there's something that, what led, do you have early experiences that led you to have that, that sort of caring about other people and that drive to make sure things are fair and inclusive? I'm sort of curious where that drive comes from.
Oh gosh, that's kind of a deep question. I think in terms of climate change specifically, it was really going to these international climate conferences and hearing the stories of other people from around the world. I think stories are such a powerful way of conveying, what we see in statistics or in, science and things like that. And for me, that was when really the spark caught flame in terms of the justice piece of climate change, was hearing stories like Carlon's about what climate change was doing to their personal lives. And there were so many other stories about, there was a young woman from the Philippines who talked about how her community, which totally relies on fisheries, was totally in decline because the fish were no longer able to survive in the waters due to climate change. And so I think that storytelling piece is huge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's great. And then maybe too, if you could talk a little bit more, you said for the Sierra Club, you support local climate action. I forget what the word you used with teams. Could you give us an example of what some of those local groups are doing?
Sure. Yeah. So they're community or climate action teams. We give the communities the chance to decide, because we found that some communities in Maine really have a hard time with the word climate because it's become so politicized, which is a whole nother conversation. But yeah, so we support teams from Portland to Fort Kent, or actually from York to Fort Kent, and from Bar Harbor to Norway, Maine. So really all across the state, in every direction. And I guess to use the Fort Kent team as an example, they started with some real community dialogues to figure out what the needs were within the community. They're a town with a lot of high energy burden, where people are paying for 2 or 3 types of heating options in the winter because everything is so expensive. And so folks are even using coal there still for heating, because it's a effective or cost-effective option. And they also found that there was a real need for more more food security initiatives like community gardens or municipal composting programs to support local gardeners. And they also found a need for community cleanups and ways to keep trash and debris out of their community, because that was an issue for them as well. And so they broke up into working groups, and they're working on solving those issues now, and also on just educating their community more about climate change and its impacts. So that's one example. And then like the Portland team, which has been around for quite a while, it has worked on the Portland One Climate Act or One Climate Future plan, which is the city's climate action plan. And they're working on a bunch of different, little campaigns around the city. So really the idea of the teams is to support local communities in what they need. Because we recognize that, climate change is not something that affects people equally, and it doesn't affect communities equally, and different communities have different needs when it comes to addressing it and creating, resilient towns and cities.
Great, thanks. I guess another thing is, I wonder if you have tips for a local land trust, for a small nonprofit, in sort of bringing in and including more diverse audiences, and also bringing in more youth into the work that we do. It's something that we talk, both things are things that we talk about a lot, but I'm just curious your tips on those topics.
Yeah, totally. I think one of them is something that I already mentioned, just continued education of both yourself and your board or your volunteers, to make sure that you're, doing the work in a way that is, aligning with your values, and in a way that is sustainable and not, going to cause harm. But I think also in terms of youth specifically, finding times that work for young people, outside of school hours or sports events hours. That might seem really small and kind of silly, but it's huge. Just making sure that folks can access meetings or events. Also, I think, providing youth or other frontline communities with stipends for their time is really important. And I think, gets at some of those inequities that we have in our society. But, if folks are juggling a job and school and, family responsibilities, it can be super hard to be able to access, activism work. And so if you can pay someone a stipend for their time to be there, that might mean that they can take an hour off of work to be able to participate. And I think also, well, actually, no, I think I'll leave it at that.
All right, thanks. Does anyone on our call have any more questions that they would like to ask? I'll give you a minute to think about them.
And while you're thinking, I'll put my email in the chat in case anyone wants to work on a climate action team or has more questions.
Mm-hmm. What are your observations on how COVID has impacted the work that you're doing, and sort of that connectedness and storytelling that you were talking about being so important?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I'm sure you've found this too with the land trust, but it's both a real hindrance and a huge opportunity. I think there's so much power in in-person events, and to be able to feel the energy in a room and to really interact with people. And it's such a powerful way of conveying, stories and information. But also being virtual is such a gift to be able to reach more people, to be able to provide more options for folks, and to make things ultimately more inclusive. That we do need to work on broadband in Maine, and making sure that we can truly have everyone participate. But going back to the Fort Kent group that I was working with, we've had a volunteer say that there's no way she would have gotten involved had we not been virtual. And she's advocating for us to stay virtual forever, because it allows people like her in a state that is so big as Maine to be able to get involved and to stay involved in a way that just wouldn't be feasible if we were continuing to organize in person.
That makes a lot of sense. All right, we have a question here. Dave asks, do you have examples of campaigns where activists have won out over entrenched and powerful interests like fossil fuel companies, and lessons learned from that?
That is a good question. I'm trying to think of a good example. Definitely one of the examples is the Summit natural gas fight that I talked about earlier. That was really a grassroots and activist led fight. We brought out over 200 folks to a virtual town meeting and really overpowered the natural gas company and showed the town that the folks didn't want it. And that worked, and the fossil fuel company was afraid, and the next day they pulled out the proposal. But more large scale, I guess, national fights, you can think of the Dakota Access Pipeline fight, which has been happening for many years, but was really won because of activists and on the ground power pushing against the fossil fuel companies. I think in terms of lessons learned, I think change really has possibility to come from the grassroots, and grassroots power is really powerful. And that's where we've seen a lot of success in things like fossil fuel companies and winning out against them. Certainly, legal means are possible too, but these fossil fuel companies have so much money and so much political power that oftentimes it really is people power, and that moral, I don't know, sort of the moral compass that comes with seeing grassroots power that ends up flipping the switch. And so, I think really in terms of lessons, it's really that we need to power the grassroots and give everyday folks the power to stand up to fossil fuel companies and the big Goliaths that seem unstoppable but really are not.
Yeah, great. Another question is, so you mentioned, climate being a political issue. With a lot of things are political issues now, but if you had an experience of successfully bridging the divide, sort of reaching someone who you didn't think you were gonna reach, who maybe now cares a bit about climate change. I wonder if you've had an experience like that.
Yeah. I think a general theme that I've found from those experiences are, especially in Maine, people really care about where we live. And I think we have the real privilege in the state to have so much, open space and protected land, and really everyone, or most people, no matter their political affiliation, has some relationship with our state and the outdoors. And I think that is a huge benefit to the climate movement in Maine. But another thing kind of going off that theme is that, everyone has something that they love and care about. And because climate change is going to affect everything, and already is affecting a lot of things, it's pretty easy to, go from that place of love and find a kind of meeting point. And sometimes that means not mentioning climate change at all, and using different terminology like sustainability or energy efficiency or sustainable development, things like that. There are a lot of ways to still solve climate change without mentioning the term. And I think also, the fossil fuel industry led a very successful disinformation campaign when it came to climate change. And a lot of folks were harmed by it, and a lot of folks don't believe in climate change because of it. And so I think also being compassionate towards those folks is always helpful as well. But yeah, I think, in the town of Millinocket, we've been working with a group of climate activists who, by not using the terms climate change, but instead focusing on, sustainable development and terms like that, have come a long way in getting their municipal buildings more energy efficient, because it'll save the town money, but also will save their carbon footprints. And also they've worked towards more food security efforts with farmers markets and opportunities for local food producers and things like that. And so for them, at least, it was all about framing, but recognizing that shared love for community or whatever it might be.
That's really interesting. Thank you. I think that's good insight to help us all. All right. So I think we will sign off. I'll give you 30 more seconds to type in your questions if you have any. But in the meantime, I'll just say that I really appreciate you talking with us today, Ania, and it was really interesting, and just really, it's refreshing to hear you talk. So I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. And I appreciate everyone tuning in. And Julie, I appreciate your time, and thanks for facilitating too. And I hope everybody has a really lovely evening.
Great. All right. So I'll say good night, everyone, and we'll see you next time. All right.